CO2 in this, the CO2 in the stream may be 8 to 15%. And so significant expense has to go into capturing, separating the CO2 out of the stream so that we can just sequester CO2. Let's talk about the U quickly. I think the U really came about first because CO2 EOR, which has been going on for 50 plus years, is a commercial utilization of CO2. And that's the largest piece of the U when we talk about the U in CCUS. And although the CO2 is used to produce more oil, a percentage of that CO2 does remain stored in the reservoir while the flood is active. And overall calculations have been made to show that there is, at the end of the day, even though oil is being produced, there is a net life cycle reduction in CO2, hence an impact on climate change. A lot of people are experimenting with and have funding to find other utilizations in non-EOR use of CO2. What still needs to be done, though, is to really prove economic feasibility and scale up so that other applications or uses of CO2 can actually be scaled up so they can make a dent on climate change. And then lastly, of course, storage we've been talking about thus far, and that's the bulk of my of what I'm going to talk about going forward, and in specific saline, deep saline storage. So for those of you not that familiar with what's in the subsurface in geology, I would say we're basically, where will we find storage? Well, we're looking for sediments that were once on the surface of the earth. Tens of millions of years ago, the surface of the earth looked similar to the way it looks today, only things were in different places. And at that point in time, particles of rock might have tumbled down from mountains and been transported by rivers out to the seas and beyond. And all along the pathway, sediments are deposited, such as what you see in the picture here on a point bar of a meandering river, or obviously everybody is familiar with a beach and the sand grains on a beach. So let's use that as an example of a sedimentary deposit, a beach. And tens of millions of years ago, there were beaches and there were sand grains there. And those sand grains now have been buried deep in the earth. And why are we looking for them? Because by the time they got to the beach, they were rounded as, and you could almost consider them as marbles. And if you took a cylinder and filled it with those sand grains, those rounded grains, and you filled it with water, about 40% of that cylinder would be water, 60% would be the sand. And over the tens of millions of years, they get buried deeper and deeper into the earth. They get crushed and compacted, and they can lose, or they do lose often, that pore space, the 40%. And a storage site, a good storage site, might have 20% pore space. We call that space where the water is porosity or pore space. And that's the space between those grains that we're going to inject CO2 into and try to store CO2. So now that we know where we're looking in the earth, let's talk about what would make a site commercial. And so the first thing that has to be evaluated is, just because I find a pile of sand and it has some ability to store CO2, first thing I have to do is estimate the capacity. How much can it store? So in a commercial situation, an emitter will tell us how much CO2 they have, how much they want to store over a lifetime. And that's when we do the geologic analysis, that's going to dictate how much acreage they will need to acquire based on the properties of the earth and the pore space that's available underneath that acreage. So as an example, I talked about 80% sand, 20% pore space. And that pore space, remember, is filled with water, salt water. So we have to move out that water when we're injecting the CO2. And a really optimal situation would be if we can get 5% of that volume CO2. So based on our volumetric calculations from parameters that we collect in the earth, we can make calculations and try to figure out how big is the cylinder that we would need, and hence how much acreage do we need on top of that cylinder. So that's surely an economic number there, is capacity. The next critical economic factor for a commercial site is injectivity. Now that we have found a site, how easy is it to get the CO2 injected into those formations? This is largely related to an earth property we call permeability, and the easiest way to think about that is it's related to the size of the grains. So if I take a little glass on the right that has big grains or marbles, and I fill it with water, you can imagine the water flowing quickly through those grains and filling up fast. But if the grains were small, the path between those grains from space to space is tortuous, and it will fill slower. So the size of the grains and hence the permeability will dictate how many wells I need to inject a given volume of CO2, and that's expensive. And so now, most importantly, let's talk about containment. And this is obviously the regulators want to make sure the CO2 can be contained. So in order to get a permit, you will have to prove containment. What processes are happening here? So if I take my block of earth here, that'll be miles. My site is likely to be miles in diameter. And it will be deeper than 2,500 foot, roughly. And the reason for that is, as was said previously, the CO2 is compressed into a supercritical, let's call it a liquid-like form. So it's compressed pipe and injected as a liquid. And if you're deeper than 2,500 foot, generally, the pressure and temperature of the earth will keep it in that phase. And you want it to stay as a liquid. It reduces the amount of volume, it's less mobile, et cetera. So the first thing we need to get the CO2 into the saline formation is a well. And just quickly, for those of you not familiar with wells, you drill a hole in the ground, you put steel casing in it. This outer black cylinder is steel. You pump cement in its liquid form down through the center of that steel. You will have calculated exactly how much cement you need. You follow that cement with a plug.
Sorry, you are unmuted, Mike. Because we have
Am I okay now? Okay.
Yes.
The CO2, the cement in the blue and white squeezes up through the backside of that casing, hardens, and now you have integrity and no fluids can move behind that casing from zone to zone. And a wireline or other tool service is used then to lower explosive charges into the well, blow a hole through the casing, through the cement into your saline formation so that now you can put tubing or a thinner casing string down the middle through which you inject your liquid CO2, and it goes through the casing, through the cement, into the saline formation that we spoke of. Now, when the CO2 enters, it's buoyant. And so different than other forms of disposal, wastewater injection, et cetera, we're dealing with a buoyant fluid now. So it wants to move up. So the other requirement we need is, and a regulatory requirement, is a caprock layer. And think of that as a layer where the grains I spoke about are microscopically small. When compressed together, nothing can move through it. So if that's the case, the CO2 would move up to that layer and then seek higher ground and spread out. And so that's what's going on during injection. And the things one has to prove are, firstly, depending upon the volume of CO2 you have and understanding the Earth's parameters and the dip and the permeability, porosity, pressures, et cetera, with models, one calculates how far will the CO2 travel at the end of its lifetime, post-injection. And once we calculate that, we can understand that and the pressure wave in front of it, we can come up with an area of review. And then everything above that area of review has to be studied and proven that there won't be leakage pathways. So we have to look for wells in the pathway that could be a leakage. We have to make sure that caprock is all the way there and will contain the CO2. And as has been mentioned earlier, we have to make sure there are no fractures through that caprock that could be leakage pathways, no faults that could potentially be leakage pathways. We have to consider induced seismicity, the impact of the injection to create micro, and I emphasize the word micro, I hate to use the word earthquake, but very, very small impacts that could get worse. And we have to know what happens to this displaced water. Remember, there is already water in that formation. So pressure will increase, water will move away. Ideally, we want a scenario where we're putting a teacup of water in a swimming pool. And so the volume of CO2 should be small relative to the amount of salt water in the basin. So what happens to the CO2 then over the thousands of years? The good news is as we move in time, the CO2 gets more and more secure because of the different trapping mechanisms that occur over time. So the first trapping mechanism in early time, as shown in this diagram by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, shows that the trapping I already talked about, structural. The CO2 physically can't get above the cap rock. Now, secondly, and a little bit later in time, and very important, is residual trapping. So as the CO2 moves from pore to pore through the sand grains, bits of CO2 will snap off in the pore throats and be left behind and stick to the grains themselves. And a residue of a sort will be left behind. So you get residual trapping. Imagine you take a glass full of sand and you fill it with oil, and then you try to pour the oil back out of that glass. Much of it will remain in the glass because it's stuck to the grains. And so that's a very powerful trapping mechanism. And that's also the reason why when we stop injecting, while the CO2 will continue to move for an amount of time, it will eventually stop because there's nothing pushing from behind because of residual trapping. Further out in time, CO2 will actually dissolve into the water. As it dissolves, it becomes heavier and it descends. And so the moral of the story of this slide is that over time, the CO2 gets more and more secure. And that's why, from a regulatory perspective, you can be relieved of your liabilities after X amount of time if you can prove these processes. So some of the data that needs to be collected in order to make all those calculations I spoke of are, and I won't spend much time here, but 2D seismic is used where we bounce sound waves off the earth, and sound moves through the earth, and when it hits a layer, it bounces up to the surface and goes through that layer and then hits the next layer and bounces up. And so with very sophisticated listening equipment and sound making sources and computer processing, with sound, we can map in 2 dimensions the layers of the earth as you see in this picture. And in this particular picture, you have the different black and white layers, but someone colored in blue and yellow. There was interest in those layers. And that might be 100 miles across or 10,000 foot down. And they map these black lines are faults because you can see the layers jump from place to place. So that's the type of work that gives us the broad, large picture of a potential storage site. Similarly, if you record your sound wave in a checkerboard pattern, sound bounces in all directions. So now you can get a cube of seismic, and with computer visualization and tools, you can look inside that cube and see actually the shape and structure of those potential storage formations and/or caprock layers. Now, seismic will not give you the detailed information I talked about earlier in terms of porosity and permeability, what type of rock, and that's where wireline logging comes in. And a truck will come out and lower different types of tools with different physics on them into the well, spool it up, and measurements will be taken as those tools come up through the formations. As an example, a resistivity tool will attempt to pass current through the earth. And we know that salt water will enable the conductivity of electricity, whereas solid rock does not. So each of the different measurements, and there are many that are used, can be put together to piece together the puzzle of the subsurface. And complementing that are samples, cores, can be taken out of the earth and brought to labs to compare to those measurements. Images of the inside of the hole, the borehole, can be taken so we can look and see if there's fractures or see the layers in their dip. And then also testing data is very important. And that testing can be done in lots of different techniques, but we inject fluids into the formation and we take fluids out of the formation to understand boundaries, pressures, fluid types, etc. Next is a critical thing is what we do with that data. So there's two types of models that are built, and commercial modeling software that's been used in the oil industry is typically used in a commercial setting. And the first thing we do is build what's called a static model. And that's, I like to call that the photograph or the 3D image of the Earth as it exists today. That's our rendering of how we see the Earth before injection. And once that's done, we can take that model and using commercial software also build a dynamic model. So we place a well or wells into that static model. We inject CO2 and we look at the evolution of that CO2 up to 100 years. And so what we've done in this model, as I'm showing in my diagram, is it's a 3-mile sand body, 1 mile of width, 1,200 foot thick, can be divided up into 1 million cells, each cell maybe being the size of a large house or a mansion. And each of those cells could have a different property than the neighboring cell. And that's dictated by geologic principles or data that we have, et cetera. So by knowing the different properties from cell to cell, we can then run the movie of how will the CO2 migrate through all these cells. And on the right, I'm showing, for example, after 20 years, we see in red, the concentration. Red is a high concentration of CO2 coming up to the top of that sand body where the cap rock would be. And so we're looking at location, in which of these cells is the CO2, in what concentration is it, at what time does it arrive? And then we can strip away all the non-CO2 cells and see what it looks like in 50 or more years. And so that's critical because now, remember, this is only a simulation and a prediction. We will have to validate that during the operational period of a project with monitoring and prove that CO2 is where it is at and when we said it was going to be and in what concentration. And so my last slide, let's come to the life of a project and walk through a lot of the things I talked about and when they happen. So in the very beginning of a project, the project developer, I have two curves here, cost and uncertainty. And as we know, in the beginning, uncertainty of the subsurface is large, and it always will be some uncertainty. We never know exactly 100% what's down there. So the first thing we try to do is gather up all of the existing data we have and do desktop studies, basically to identify if it's worth spending money to move forward. We look at desktop studies in two phases, preliminary and then more sophisticated, where we do some of the preliminary modeling to determine the area review and so forth. Now, once you've moved past desktop studies and a gap analysis is done with respect to, do you have the data you need to get a permit? The next steps that I show here in characterization and design phase are drilling a data well, collecting data, shooting 2D or 3D seismic if needed, and filling out the permit application we've talked about before. And that gets you out about a year or two. And there are significant costs with drilling the well, shooting the seismic, and filling out the permit application is no easy task. When we get to, when we submitted the application, we have to anticipate a year or so to get approval. And so there will be some cost doing geotechnical work back and forth with the regulators. And then we get to a permit to construct. And now we simply have to construct what we said we were going to build in the permit. And at this point in time, the Capex jumps up because now we're adding wells, injector wells, monitoring wells, installing the rest of the monitoring equipment that we said we were going to install. And we now go back to the regulator and ask for approval to inject. Once we get that, we're in an operational phase. And what happens during operations is until you start injecting, and you get your permit, you've been making these predictions, but you will never be 100% certain, as I stated. So what you're trying to do is understand the uncertainty and bound the uncertainty. What's the worst case? What's the range of uncertainties? And you're trying to make sure that before you start operations, that range of uncertainty is at least manageable, so that no matter what scenario happens with the ultimate rebuilding of your model, that any of those new models are manageable. So during the operational phase, you're doing the same thing. And while you're injecting, while of course there are the basic things you have to do, like maintain the wells and maintain your monitoring equipment, who knows, you might have to replace wells, do field activities and so forth. But you will have data coming in from different monitoring technologies, some coming in minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, weekly, monthly, annually, etc. And as that data comes in, you use it to compare it to your models. You update your model and you make new predictions and you iterate that cycle as you get more and more data, ultimately driving down uncertainty, with the goal being that when you stop injecting, there's a regulatory requirement to continue monitoring for 50 years or more. And the goal would be that if you have strong conformance at that point in time to your models, and you're submitting the same report over and over and over again, showing where the CO2 is and showing its conformance, the goal is to get early regulatory release. And let's see, that was my last slide, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, John. So do you have any questions? Let's start with, okay, we have the first question from Tariq. He said, what kind of carbon capturing technologies are available in the industry and why is the cost?
So there are a variety of carbon capture technologies. I would say the most popular is amine. You're basically building a chemical plant and you're using a chemical to grab the molecule of CO2 and you use energy to heat and cool. And that allows at one temperature for the molecule to be grabbed and at another temperature for it to be released. And when talking about the cost, I'll give an analogy. If you had a 500 megawatt power plant, you would probably use 1/3 of the power from that plant just to run the capture equipment. So that's a significant cost. And that's why we need greater policy or a higher price per ton to really get this industry kicked off and to be able to do the large projects where capture is important.
Thank you, John. So the second question, he said, it's a hard question from Eddie to answer, depends on what you want to do, what was just shown in the reservoir simulator, plus the geomodeling software specific to what was shown. It's Petrel plus Eclipse. When talking the modeling and characterization aspect together with the reservoir simulation, there are only 2 software packages that have that level of functionality and integration currently in the industry. I think this is the answer for Tariq questions. Okay, so another question we have from Jim, he said, how many CCUS projects are underway actually injecting CO2 in the US?
So let me define project. There are many CO2 EOR projects, like I said, that have been going on for decades and decades. So if we factor out enhanced oil recovery, and if we talk purely saline storage, CO2 being injected at some commercial scale, the only projects that have gotten a class, the only project that has gotten a Class 6 permit and is actually injecting CO2 into a saline formation is Archer Daniels Midland indicator. So in terms of active and operating, injecting CO2 and doing this project, there is only one. It's actually the culmination of two projects, but it's only one. And all other commercial projects are in some phase prior to construction, as I've defined in this chart. So there are many other projects, I can't count them, but there are people doing desktop studies, there are people drilling wells, there are people preparing to submit a permit, there are those who have submitted permits, and there are a couple of permits to construct that have been approved. But that's a bit the state of things right now.
Thank you. So another question from Maria. She said, does Battelle have currently CCUS projects ongoing, and what stage?
So thanks for the question. And as I just said earlier, we actually have projects in all those stages I mentioned. So, we have a significant portfolio of projects that our technical staff are working on. And we've done everything from the desktop studies to drilling wells, to shooting seismic, to constructing the permit application, to getting a permit application. Once again, all of our projects are in those different stages, but none yet are operating.
Okay, thank you. So another question from Ismail. He said, the sequestration projects are expected to last 1,000 years or thousands of years. And it seems like monitoring is the key part of the update and success of the project. How long the monitoring will be done in these projects past 50 years?
I'm going to answer this from a regulatory perspective. The EPA is calling for 50 years. I believe California CARB is 100 years. So while you're correct in saying that processes of the CO2 in the subsurface could go on past that, from a regulatory perspective, the worst case monitoring that we know of today would be 100 years of monitoring. In most cases, 50 years. And in some states, they're trying to bring that down to 10 in terms of the requirement to monitor. Now, I would state again, as my hope would be that if one has done a good job with site selection and a great job of modeling and monitoring, that the EPA would at one point, after seeing the same information reported again and again and again and again, would let you out early.
Thank you. So another question from Safyan. He said, thank you, John, for the informative and well-illustrated presentation. In terms of trapping mechanism, please, are there any field observations showing some onsets on mineral trapping? It is an attractive option for the long term.
So for the easier, I would say low-hanging fruit, commercial projects, mineralization, mineral trapping is not a significant factor in the trapping of and containment of the CO2. I would say even solubility is further down out in the future. The main trapping mechanisms at the end of the day are structure and residual trapping. And that's for these near-term, smaller, easy projects, which is the way I think the industry should start. We need to do the low-hanging fruit, the easy ones first. And so our projects pretty much rely on structural and residual trapping.
Thank you. Another question from James. He said during phase 5 and 6, there will still be ongoing Capex investments. Yeah.
Yes. Now we get into financial accounting and and of course this is a good time to clarify here. I'm only showing a slide on the subsurface activity. There's surface pipeline compression. There's Capex involved and OpEx involved in all that as well. So yes, I made a very simplistic breakover from Capex to OpEx once it starts operating, but of course you're correct. Of course, there's some Capex involved in phase 5 and 6 as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Nashikat. He said, very informative presentation. I would like to know about the units of time on your fate of injection CO2 slide. Is it days or years?
Let me go back to that slide. And that was this one. And this is an IPCC slide. And these are years. So 1 year, 10 year, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Those are years.
Okay. So Talib said only one active CO2 storage class 6 wells in Illinois, ADM facility. Another question from Hisu. He said, thank you very much for the great presentation. What's the average cost per well for the CO2 injection well?
So let's talk about well cost. And of course, it's very hard to do that because the well cost will depend on, firstly, how deep you have to drill the well. Secondly, on when you drill a well, sometimes you have to do what's called telescoping down. You have to stop part of the way down in cement casing, then drill through it. And sometimes you have to do that multiple times. So given that there are all those factors, on average, let's just say if you're just drilling a data well, it might cost you $2, $3, $4 million. If you're casing it and completing it for a monitoring well, maybe it's $5 million. If you want to make it an injector well where you have to use sophisticated cements and hardware components, maybe $6, $7, $8 million. And that's at tends to be at a shallower depth. So I'll just throw those numbers out there for you. You're looking at anywhere from 2, 3 to $6, $7, $8 million for a well.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Tariq. He said, has there been any government lobbying in the area of CCUS? What about direct air capture? Is it feasible?
Direct air capture is absolutely feasible, and there are projects and people investing and moving forward with it. The issue of direct air capture at the end of the day is just a cost issue, really. And as you can see, there were government incentives that trying to be put in place to pay $185 a ton if direct capture is used, whereas currently for the tax credits, we're at $50 a ton. So direct air capture, I'm sure the technology will be driven down. It'll get more cost effective over time, but it certainly is viable. It's just very expensive. And the sequestration is no different. At the end of the day, you have to take that CO2 and store it somewhere.
Okay, thank you, John. Another question from Muna. She said, thank you so much for your presentation. I asked this question actually during the first presentation. It couldn't be answered for the time constraint. I have not been exposed to CCS. The question may not be that deep. I'm wondering if there are industry use techniques to seal the rock cracks.
We're trying not to crack the rock. So I would say the way I would answer your question is we will, when we inject and do these projects, we will keep the injection pressures. We can understand the breaking strength of the rocks, and we will keep the pressures below an amount so that the rock won't crack. Cracking rock is hard to fix, so I won't get into that, but let's just say, let's try to avoid that.
Sorry, hello, thank you. I actually was asking if there are industry ways to seal the rocks, the cracks in the rocks, the pre-existing cracks, I mean to seal it.
If you have, so you're asking if you find a site with faults and fractures, are there industrial ways to seal those faults and fractures?
Yes, that's exactly my question.
Yeah, sure. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Another question from Amit. He said, very informative talk. I have a rather general query. What are the long-term environmental impact of geological CO2 sequestration? Are they established, particularly in the geomechanical aspect, considering increase in acidity due to CO2? I
think the general feeling amongst the technical community is that while there are highly unlikely events that could happen in the life of this industry, it's really pretty proven now to be commercial and safe. So, you know, yes, there are things that can happen, but we are not, with proper site selection, monitoring, with all the available technologies we have to mitigate, you know, I would say that it's highly unlikely. I could throw out scenarios, but I won't, but it's highly unlikely if a project was done credibly and competently that we're going to have any environmental impact, any negative environmental impact.
Okay, thank you. We may take other two questions. So another question from Chris. He said, thank you so much for the presentation. Do you see much merit in isotopic fingerprinting of the CO2 to help identify long-term leakage of the borehole or elsewhere?
I think there's enough monitoring technology that can see directly the CO2 without having to look for an additive that's added in with the CO2. And other than that, if you have multiple sources of CO2 coming from different places and you want to identify one from another, those are different issues. But for the moment, we're not investigating the use of any isotopes to mix with the CO2 for monitoring purposes. We're pretty happy with the existing technologies that there are.
Thank you. We have Nashikat is raising his hand. Do you have any question, Nashikat? You want to tell us? Okay, so we have another last question from Hisham. He said, how do you calibrate the models that you create for CCUS, as usually the injection is performed in aquifers?
The models, I'm not exactly clear on what is meant by calibrating the models, but obviously the models are only predictive. And when we get into the operational phase, we have to use monitoring to do model verification and then update and history matching and those sorts of things. So if that's what you mean by calibrating, then yes, we would use the monitoring to verify and validate and update and history match the models.
Okay, so Tariq is raising his hand. Do you have any question, Tariq? Can you mute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Habib. Yeah, John, thanks so much for your presentation. My real quick comment or question is that, you know, I'm interested in the CCUS or CCS projects, more primarily at the capturing stage. What do you think, in your opinion, are the challenges beside costs? What are the other challenges that you think are there and how we can overcome them?
Yeah, it's not capture is not my particular expertise. I'm a subsurface person, but from all I would say is, I think the main challenge of capture is cost. It's so important. The cost of capture is such an important, and whether you view cost as energy use, energy penalty, however you look at it, it comes back to cost. That seems to be our limiting factor in this industry right now, is our inability to capture cost effectively or to make the incentives high enough to cover the existing costs. So can't answer your question better than that, sorry, but I really, cost is such a big one. I just go back to that all the time.
Thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much. I think for the international question, Dr. Sir Talib will be presenting, we'll have a slide on international CCS projects in his presentation. So thank you so much, John, for your presentation and your collaboration with our SP and IDC student chapters. So do you have anything?
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
No,